Okay, so in this episode, we're going to look at Rawls' principles, and here's the first one, the basic liberties principle. Each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. And these liberties include political liberty, the right to vote and to hold public office, and freedom of speech and assembly, liberty of conscience and freedom of thought, freedom of the person, which includes freedom from psychological oppression and physical assault and dismemberment, integrity of the person, the right to hold personal property, and freedom from arbitrary arrest and seizure is defined by the concept of the rule of law. So Rawls thinks that we'll agree to that principle because everyone wants their liberty protected. He also thinks that we'll agree to a principle of equal opportunity, this principle. Social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Now, obviously, that's so that we have an equal chance of obtaining to whatever position that it is that we hope to obtain to in the society in which we create. Okay, so those are relatively uncontroversial principles. I mean, just about everybody agrees that there should be liberty, and just about everybody agrees that we should have fair equality of opportunity. But then Rawls argues for the most controversial aspect of his theory. He argues that those people who are in the original position, who are arguing from behind a veil of ignorance and are making extremely important decisions about their future, should adopt the principle that economists know as, or economists and others, game theorists and so on, know as the Maximin rather than maximizing strategy. And we need just to spend a little bit of time explaining what that means. Okay, so here's a slide that may help. So here we're just imagining one person, I mean you or some, just one person. And this person's got to choose between two options. And in each case, it's not clear what's going to happen, right? So in each case, they're taking a bit of a gamble. Right, if they go for the first option, if things go well for them, they'll go really well. But if things go badly for them, they'll go really badly. That's the 100 and the 0, where the average outcome is 50. Right, that's 100, 0, 100 divided by 2 is 50, right? So the average outcome is 50. Whereas if they go for the second option, if the best outcome is pretty good, and the worst outcome is bad, but it's not absolutely terrible, or the average outcome being 40. Which is the rational choice? Okay, now there are two ways that one can go with this. If one is going to maximize, then one will go for for the first option, and that's because that has the highest expected utility, or expected whatever it is. Right, the average is 50 and the average of the second option is only 40. So if you're trying to maximize the outcome, you would go for option 1. But there's another strategy, another decision-making strategy, which is to say, well, this is really important, the decision I'm making here, and I really don't want things to go very badly. What's really important to me is that things don't go really badly. So I'm going to choose the second option because it has the least worst outcome. Right? The worst outcome is the least bad. Right? Even though the average outcome is not as good as the first option, I'm still going to choose the second option because I don't want things to get really bad for me. And that strategy is called maximining. You're maximizing the position of the minimum. Right? You're maximizing the minimum position. Right? You're maximining. You're going for the option where the worst outcome is the best. Right? So you're not trying to maximize. You're trying to make sure that if the worst happens, it won't be too bad for you. Okay, that's maximining. And we all use maximining in some areas of life. Here are some that you may use maximining for. You may not, but you might. One would be crossing the road. So it may be true that just constantly crossing the road against the lights would actually, in the long run, lead to a better life because you save time and so on. But we don't want to get hit by a car, right? So we're very careful, and some people will even, they'll wait at the lights even when there's no traffic around. They'll wait for the light to go green, for the cross sign to come, even when there's no traffic around, because they're just cautious, right? They don't want to take the chance, right? That's maximizing. Or think about a career, for example. So imagine that, you're in a job and it's good, it's fine, but there's another career that you could choose where if things go really well, it would be great. But if things go really badly, it would just be awful. You'd have to get unemployment benefit, it would be terrible. Maybe your marriage would come under strain, whatever, you get the idea. Well, you might just choose to stay in the career that you're currently in. And that's not to be sneered at. I mean, I think we often think that, we discourage, or at least put it this way, there are plenty of people in society who think you should always go for it. But maybe you shouldn't. Maybe there are circumstances in which that's the wrong thing to do. Maybe there are circumstances in which taking the risk that would wreck your life is just not a very sensible thing to do. So there are circumstances in which maximizing would be appropriate. Now, I need to stress, this is very important, that maximizing is a rational strategy. Maximizing is also a rational strategy, and the significance of that we'll come back to. But maximizing is a rational strategy. Sometimes people think that it's only ever rational to maximize, to go, and I've had these conversations with people who think it's only ever rational to maximize, and that's just plainly not true. It's not true. Sometimes it is rational to maximin. It depends on how risk adverse you are. But the point is, what Rawls is saying, and this is important, is that maximizing is a rational strategy, and he thinks maximizing is the rational strategy to take in these circumstances. In the state of nature, when you're in the original position behind a veil of ignorance, you're making a very important decision about the future of your life. He thinks the rational thing to do is to maximin, because the risks are just simply too high. And because of this, Rawls says that we'll agree to the following crucial principle, the difference principle. Social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. Okay, so here you can see the maximizing. We're maximizing the position of the worst off. We're maximizing the minimum position. We're maximizing the position of the least well off. Social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged. Now, it's important to say that this does not argue for strict equality. Rawls is not arguing that everybody should have the same amount of resources in society, that justice requires that everybody have the same amount of resources. He's not saying that. He's saying that the least well-off in society should have the most resources that we can give them, right, in total. Now you think, well, isn't that the same? Isn't that strict inequality? Well, no, it's not. And here's the argument. Here's how is it supposed to go. So let's just take an example. This is probably the most commonly given example. So in order to become a doctor, a medical doctor, you have to, I'm not sure how long it is, but you have to go to university for 10 years. It's something like that, right? You have to train for 10 years to become a doctor. Now, they're very important, right? And they're very important in society that we have doctors, and they're very important for the people who are the least advantaged. The least advantaged people in our society need doctors, okay, like we all do. Right, so it's good for the least advantaged people in our society if we have doctors. Okay, but it takes 10 years to train to be a doctor. Right, now, who would do it if there wasn't some incentive for doing it? The argument is you're going to have to pay doctors more than the average person because they have to train for 10 years in order to do it. And if they're not paid more than the average person, they won't do it. Right, so in order to benefit the least advantaged, you can justify paying doctors more than the average. That is, you can justify that inequality. That inequality can be justified because it makes the people at the bottom better off than they would otherwise be. Because after all, if that inequality didn't exist, then there would be no doctors, right? And so therefore people at the bottom would be worse off than they would be if the inequality existed. Okay, and this is a very important point to get your head around. And I've spoken to a number of people who can't get their head around it, including rather famous economists, although none in New Zealand actually, people overseas, who think that this principle simply must argue for strict equality, and it doesn't take into account economic incentives. No, it's designed to take into account economic incentives. It may be that allowing, so let's imagine that everybody is all equal. Right? There are two people, they're just represented by my hands, and they're both equal. Right? What Rawls is saying is it may be that if we allow an inequality, that will also lift the other person. So we allow inequality, it will lift the other person. And that inequality is okay if it lifts the other person. It has to lift the other person though. So an inequality that doesn't lift the other person, that's not justified. It has to be an inequality that benefits everybody. Okay, only those inequalities are justified. Okay, so Rawls is not arguing for strict equality. He accepts that there can be inequalities. Inequalities can be justified, but only if they benefit everybody, that they have to benefit the least well off. Okay, and so therefore we arrive at Rawls' principles of justice. Now, exactly, this is really an aside, you don't need to worry too much about this, but Rawls says that there are two principles here, but I've always been struck by it. There's something very odd about how he talks about his principles of justice in general, but it's not really important, so we can ignore it. But let me just say, he says there are two principles, even though there are kind of three, and I suppose I can sort of see the rationale for that. It's because the first principle is important in a way that for reasons that we'll see, important in a way that the second principle isn't, although they're all important. But he also orders the second principle around the wrong way. Anyway, here we go. So here are the principles, and this is just putting together the slides that we've seen earlier. So first principle, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. Second principle, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, to the greatest benefit of the least advantage, consistent with the just savings principle. We'll just ignore the just savings principle here. And attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. Okay, now the first thing to say here is that these principles are the ones that we've encountered before. So the first principle is the basic liberties principle. The second principle, B, is the equality of opportunity principle. And the second principle, A, is the difference principle. Okay, and then Rawls argues that these principles are lexically ordered. Now, what does that mean? Well, the most famous example of something that's lexically ordered is the dictionary, right? So in the dictionary, everything is lexically ordered. All the A's come before all the B's before all the C's before all the D's, and so on. And it's strict in this regard. I mean, we don't say, I don't know, think of a word like, compare a word like ball with a word like, I don't know, X. We don't say, well, X, yeah, that's AX, right? And ball is BA. So, well, one starts with an A and the other with a B, but then yeah, it's AX, and X is really low in the alphabet, and BA, well, A is high in the alphabet. So maybe we should put ball in the dictionary before X. Right? We don't do that, right? We just go, no. All the A's come before all the B's. Right, so it's a strict ordering, right? I mean, sometimes I think if judges produced the dictionaries, they'd put ball before axe because they'd come up with some kind of proportionality argument that meant that ball should come before axe. But anyway, perhaps we shouldn't worry about that. All the A's come before all the B's before all the C's. Now, what does that mean in this case? Right, it means that the three principles, let's just call them three principles. The three principles come in a lexical order. They're ordered. One principle comes before the other principle comes before the other principle. Right, and that means that the principle that's higher up trumps the principle that's lower down. Okay, so let me just go back to the slide and have a look at this. The lexical ordering of the principle is as follows. The basic liberties principle, followed by the equality of opportunity principle, followed by the difference principle. And this is why I don't know why Rawls put it this way. I mean, because he's got them in a different order, right? He's got basic liberties principle, difference principle, equality of opportunity principle. That's not the ordering that they're supposed to have. The lexical ordering is basic liberties principle, equality of opportunity principle, and difference principle. Okay, now what that means is that the basic liberties principle has to be completely satisfied before we even turn to the other principles. Okay, we ignore the equality of opportunity principle and the difference principle until the basic liberties principle is completely satisfied. And once the basic liberties principle is satisfied, we go on to the equality of opportunity principle and satisfy that, completely ignoring the difference principle. We ignore the difference principle until the other two principles have been completely satisfied. And the slogan for this is liberty before welfare. Liberty before welfare. There's a lexical ordering between liberty and welfare. Liberty comes first. Now, what this means, one of the things that this means, is there can't be any conflict between the principles in Rawls's view. There can't be any conflict between the principles because when it looks like there's a conflict between them, the lexically prior principle wins. Right? The higher principle wins. So if there's an apparent conflict between, say, the basic liberties principle and the difference principle, we ignore the difference principle and pay attention only to the basic liberties principle. That's a consequence of the lexical ordering. Okay, that's how the principles are supposed to work. In the next episode, we're going to talk more about rules on resources and some other related matters.